this is Get Into Woodworking. Last time we were doing some work on the scalable table and we're going to continue that today. I'm also going to be talking a bit about planing. When I left you last time I was going away to cut the leg blanks and I've done them all 8 of them. I cross cut and ripped them with a combination saw that I showed you and it all went very smoothly. Cross cutting was actually very easy with this saw. The ripping not quite as good as using a dedicated rip saw, but I was actually quite impressed. Now ripping these legs has left the edges rough, so I'll be using a hand plane to smooth those up a bit in a minute. But more importantly, we're going to be laminating 2 of these pieces together for each leg. The reason for that is we're going to offset the tops to leave us a half lap joint with the rails. Now because we're going to be laminating them, we want them to go together nice and tightly. We don't want big gaps. Wood glues don't like gaps, so we're going to be using a hand plane to flatten each of the surfaces that are going to get glued together. I've dug out a number 5 plane. I've got a curved blade in it. That may all sound a little bit new to you. We probably haven't talked about numbering of planes and about the curved or straight blades. So I'll explain a little bit about that as we go along. Bench planes come in a range of sizes. This is the largest, a number 8. They come down to a middle size number 5 and a number 4, and go down to very small ones. For components at the bench, like we're going to be doing today, roughly 18 to 24 inches long, we're going to be using a number 5. It's a good comfortable weight to use, and it's also long enough to make sure that components of the sizes we're dealing with can be prepared nice and straight. Now number 4 is generally known as a smoother plane. The shorter sole on it, it can get into slight undulations of the work to get the work smooth. It's also long enough though to be able to prepare these components. So if you've only got a number 4, don't worry, you'll be able to do all this perfectly okay. So just a quick recap on planes. Basically a long body with a flat sole on the bottom, a hole called the mouth through which the blade comes through, a rear handle, a front handle or knob, a heavy cast section in the middle here called the frog, which holds the blade and attaches to the body, a blade attached to a chip breaker, and then a lever cap on top holding all the assembly together. There's an adjuster knob here for setting the depth of cut, and a lateral adjustment lever here which determines which corner of the blade is more pronounced out of the sole. If I slip this apart, you can see that the blade at the bottom is attached to a chip breaker on the top, and the chip breaker puts a lot of pressure against the blade down near the edge just to make it a little bit stiffer. Going back further in time, you'd find that planes just had a single iron, but it would be a lot thicker. This chip breaker just helps to give it the same sort of rigidity. Also worth mentioning is the shape of the blade. These will come nice and straight and square to the edge. But there's a slight problem with that. If you're working on a wide board, you can see that if it's nice and square in the corner here, you're going to end up with a step cut into the board. So a lot of people will just knock off that corner in a slight radius, and that helps a little bit. Another option is to curve the whole blade with just a very shallow arc. When you buy your plane, it should be assembled in the correct way, which means that the blade will have its bevel facing down and the chip breaker will be on the top. I'm sure 99% of planes come like that, but I have heard stories where they've been installed upside down. when you put your blade back in, you need to make sure that this pin that comes through from the depth adjuster goes into the slot in the chip breaker, and that the slot in the back of the blade falls over this large cam or washer that's on the lateral adjuster. If you get all of that right, you should find that the blade assembly sits nice and flat onto the frog. When you've clamped down the lever cap, and some of them have nailed screws on there rather than a lever, you should still be able to adjust the plane with the depth adjuster without too much trouble, and you should also be able to move the blade with the lateral adjuster. You don't need to over tighten it. So moving back to the table, let's get these laminations nice and flat. This is going to be one of the rails, and as you can see, these two pieces don't match up very well. I'm sure with plenty of clamping pressure we might be able to pull them tight, but we wouldn't be able to control then what the ends were like. They might be slightly twisted from each other, and we want those straight so that the legs come down from the table nice and straight. Now I know I've got a flat bench. You might want to find something else that's flat if your bench isn't perfectly flat. Lay your component down on there, and I think you can hear, probably even see, that that's rocking. And by assessing against the flat reference, you'll be able to tell which parts are high and which are low. Here I'm rocking on these two corners, so if I flip the board over, it's telling me that this corner and this corner are higher than they need to be. So this corner's low, we don't want to remove any material from there. Same with that corner. This corner's high, so we do want to remove some material there, and this corner's high, so we'll remove some material there. And the way we'll do that is plane perhaps 2/3 of this component right from this end through to about here and stop, and then on this other side we'll start planing about 2/3 of the way across from here right the way through the end. So let's see how that works out in practice. Before we start planing, it's worth looking at the grain of the wood to avoid any tear out, and I'm seeing the grain here is rising out of the top that we're going to be planing in this direction. So the best way to plane it would be in that direction, pushing the fibres down. So I'll turn that round, stick it up against my bench dog, and we can start planing. Now how have I set the plane up for this? I've got my curved blade, so it's going to be cutting deepest in the middle of its width. So I want to put the middle of the plane on perhaps this first third of our component. That means I'll be feathering out towards the middle, and the other side that's feathering out is off the side of the board. So just a quick reminder, this is low, this is high, so we'll start with the blade just inside the end here, plane all the way through. Then we'll move across to the front edge where this is low and this is high, so we'll start with the blade off the end and plane not quite all the way to the end before lifting off. And go back and check. And that's much better already. Now there's virtually no movement on that at all now. Just perhaps a very slight rock in this direction where we've left the middle perhaps a little bit high. So now what I'll do is take a set of shavings right the way through from end to end, work across the whole width of the board, and that should help to flatten it out across its width. And that's perfect. Now don't expect to be able to do that straight away if you're not used to hand planing. It does take practice, but if you think carefully about how you're trying to make this piece of wood flat and where you need to remove material from, you'll get there in the end. Now I need to prepare a flat side on this component so we can glue them together. And that's looking more like it. Now I just have to repeat that process with the other rail and the 8 sections for the 4 legs. I have all my legs nicely planed up flat, ready for gluing together. Also my rails. Now I need to turn my attention to the edges. I've taken one of the original legs to use as a pattern, laying that along one of these straight edges of the board and marked around with pencil. And now I'm going to plane down to that line to tidy up the ripped side of the board. I'm leaving it still a little bit long and square on the ends because that just makes it a lot easier to clamp. I've got grain direction which is going a bit like that, so I'm going to plane from here that way, then turn around and plane down this way. I'm just about down to the line here, so I'll just concentrate a bit more down at this end. I don't know if you can see, I've just about left the line the whole way. Now I'm going to check it with my tri-square just to make sure we're reasonably square on the edges. That's fine. Now I want to take its pair from the stack, work out where they want to be clamped together, and then plane down this edge so it's flush with the other edge. I'll just clamp both ends lightly to hold the boards together, and checking that this rear edge here is flush, and it pretty much is. I can feel very slight variance, but once the leg's glued up we can just flush that off. Main thing here is to take this surface which was ripped with the saw and bring that down level with the other. So that's completed the 2 sections for that one leg. They're nice and flush. Now I'm going to take both of these, sandwich the bits for the other leg in between, like so, and then take off the excess, bring them all down exactly the same. Last bit of planing today is to take all the sections for the top and plane all the joint lines. The 2 sections of the top to come together and remain flat once they're glued. These 2 edges need to be flat, and they either need to be perpendicular to the face or they need to be complementary to each other, so that when they're put together they don't throw things out like that. Now one way we can plane that is to open up the joint like this and plane that nice and straight. If we introduce a slight error in the angle, because we've opened them up like a book, the angles will complement each other, and when we close up again it'll be nice and flat.
So first of all I plane until I get a full width shaving from both of the boards. Here I'm testing for straight, and I'm getting rotation in the middle, so there's a slight hump. Now for joining boards together, it either wants to be perfectly flat or a very slight hollow. So I'm going to take some stop shavings in the middle of the component, and that should hollow it out very slightly. And as you can see, we're not quite there yet. Once a straight edge rotates on the end of the component, we know it's either straight or very slightly hollowed. And we end up with a lovely tight joint and a flat surface.
So I've jointed all the edges for the top now, and you can see we've got our full circle there, virtually the same as the original. And one of the advantages of jointing it as well as we did is that it takes no pressure to hold all those joints lovely and tight together with no gaps. So when it comes to gluing up, we don't need a huge number of clamps or anything, simply need to hold it in position. And I'm going to show you a method where we can clamp this just with another piece of pallet wood and a few offcuts. I've screwed on a block at each end, which just leaves a little gap big enough for a pair of folding wedges. So a couple of wedges which, when they push together, expand the distance between their two edges. They just about fit in on their own in that gap. If I press them together and squeeze, those wedges exert more than enough pressure to hold all the boards tightly together. Now this is the top surface of the table at the moment, and I want to glue it with the top surface down on the bench nice and flat. So I want all the irregularities to be on the back of the table, so that when I clean that up, if I have any problems with tear out, at least it's on the underside. And that's how I'm going to glue it. Press down onto the bench and just a light bit of pressure from the sides. I'm going to be using Titebond for this. If you're using this table indoors, then any PVA adhesive will be fine. If you haven't subscribed already and you want to follow this build, please subscribe. If you like what I'm doing, give me a like and share it with someone else. See you next time.
Please take a moment to like, comment and subscribe, and follow me on social media for extra photos and videos from the workshop. Cheerio!